for our webinar on observations of fundamental drivers in SPP's new integrated marketplace. And just so you all know, we'll be providing the slides and recording to all the registrants following the webinar. And if you have any questions throughout, please feel free to type them into the GoToWebinar panel on the right side of your screen, and we'll get to them at the end. I'll turn it over now to Stephen Stronzi, our Regional Director of SPP, and Adam Jordan, our SPP Analyst.
Thanks, Jamie. Well, thanks for joining us this afternoon, everyone. We're here to discuss what we've seen so far in the new SPP integrated marketplace. For those who may be unfamiliar with SPP, on March 1st, SPP went live with its day-ahead real-time market. So this was the most recent, RTO to go to the day-ahead real-time structure. And a nodal market, since ERCOT back in, I think, 2010 or 2011. So with that, we'll kind of jump in here and get started. What we're going to discuss today is just a quick background on Genscape and what we do and who we are. We're going to go through a couple details on some of the fundamentals that we've seen so far in SPP. We're going to talk about some early observations, what we've seen happen over the first 4 months from March through the end of June in the new integrated marketplace. And we're going to give a quick look at what we expect to see for the rest of the summer here for July and August. And then at the end, we'll go through and answer any questions that anyone has or anything that comes up throughout the presentation. As Jamie mentioned, you can type them into the box on the right side of your screen. You should all see a question section there, and you can type questions in there, and we'll take them. And we're going to hold the questions till the end, but feel free to type them in at any time, and we'll answer them when we get to the end of the report. So with that, let's kind of jump right in here. First of all, just some brief background on Genscape, and specifically what we do here in the Boston office. Back in 2008, Genscape actually acquired what was here in the Boston office, a company called Enva Power. Our primary focus is providing actionable power market intelligence, and our flagship product suite is our Power IQ products, where we're providing price forecasts and risk scenarios for all the major RTOs across the country. So we have a team of 40 to 50 analysts here covering PJM, MISO, ERCOT, California, now SPP, as well as WEC and California, also New York and New England. So we're covering all the major ISOs. And with SPP's launch of day-ahead real-time, we just launched our own Power IQ product for SPP. So just a little detail on kind of what we're doing here, that I think the important takeaway from the foundation of our analytical approach is that we're here using our own proprietary models. We're not necessarily using third-party models or third-party software. We've developed our own models to forecast demand, to forecast wind. And as part of our service, our clients receive those hour-by-hour wind forecasts or those hour-by-hour demand forecasts, as well as the price forecast and congestion risks that we're doing. And you also get access as part of the service to our analysts, so you can talk to our team at any point throughout the day to get a feel for what's going on in the marketplace. So, jumping in here to look at the SPP fundamentals. Just a couple quick facts on what we've seen so far. And again, for those who may be less familiar with SPP, the footprint as it stands currently spreads from Nebraska all the way down to Louisiana and out into the Texas Panhandle. The major cities that we are looking at on a regular basis as far as being the bigger drivers of load are Omaha, Kansas City, Wichita, Tulsa, Amarillo, and Oklahoma City. And also looks like just, a recent development here that the Dakotas and Basin Electric are, potentially going to be joining SPP in the next year or so. So already a significant development that, is going to increase the footprint even further across the middle of the United States here. So from March through June, marginal energy costs in SPP have averaged around $40 in the real time and about $45 in the day ahead for the on-peak period. So what we're looking at there is simply the marginal energy cost and not including the cost of congestion. When we factor in congestion and losses, the LMPs for South Hub have averaged about $44 and $47 in the real time and day ahead. So South Hub has typically been congested up with a lot of the wind-driven constraint that we see, or congestion that we see and we have seen so far. And that wind also seems to push down North Hub, where you see an average of $36 and $39 respectively. You can also notice that there's a fairly considerable day-ahead real-time spread that's been somewhat consistent for the most part, and again, we a lot of times chalk that up to the wind and the north to south congestion that has been pretty persistent in the footprint. For the supply stack, coal is definitely the dominant fuel source. From March through June, when we look at the data provided by SPP, coal has accounted for approximately 62% of the supply during the on-peak period. And wind generation is also a key driver. We're looking at wind as accounting for around 10% of the supply. And I think we're talking about an installed capacity of wind in SPP of around 8.5 to 9 gigawatts. And with peak load that you can see in the next bullet there of only around 42,000, 8 to 9 gigs is a fairly considerable chunk of that load when you look at the wind generation and when wind is strong in SPP. We do also have some slides that highlight this generation stack in the appendix at the end of the presentation, which we'll briefly go through at the end, but they will be available on the slide deck that everyone gets after the presentation. As we mentioned, the peak load was 42 gigs, or 42.5 gigs, and that actually occurred yesterday. Is that right? That's yesterday. In hour ending 16. And the record reported load in SPP was around 55 gigs, and that was back in 2011. So we're quite a ways away from that load at this point, but that was August of 2011, and that was when, looking at a lot of the temperatures across the southern half of the footprint, they were around 107 degrees for the high. I think we noticed that the lows for the day were in the upper 80s. So we haven't got up into that 50,000 megawatt range yet. And not necessarily, we'll get to that a little bit in our forecast for the future, but so far 42.5 is the max that we've seen through the first couple of days of July here. When we look at the average temperatures across the footprint, one thing that's we're seeing a lot now with MISO's integration of Entergy is the wide temperature spreads that you get across these large geographical footprints. Where in SPP right now, where we've seen a high of or average of 87 degrees in Oklahoma City, but things getting down to as low as 23 degrees in Omaha during March. So that's definitely something that we're going to continue to watch and really see as a big driver of congestion and separation between the north and south hubs. I should mention the north hub is primarily made up of NPPD points up in Nebraska, while the south hub is down in primarily made up of the Oklahoma gas and electric points, as well as other points down in the south. So you have, geographically, I would correlate them to around Oklahoma City and Omaha, although they're more correlated to the different nodes than necessarily a geographic location. But that's kind of what we're looking at, and it's something to watch out for there is how the temperature spreads are going to play a big part in what we see with congestion and how we see that driving the LMP spread between north and south. And the last quick note here is that through June, SPP has been a slight net importer. We'll definitely get into more details on this later. But on the average, if you look at a 24-hour period, SPP averages approximately just 6 megawatts of imports. So some of the early observations that we've seen in SPP. So here we're just going to kind of go through some of the things that we found interesting and that we were looking at when we're doing our daily work here and our daily price forecast. We're going to talk about kind of how the major cities and temperatures compare to, or how they correlate with pricing, how clear demand and the load forecast and how they're shaping up over commitments. We're going to talk about net scheduled interchange, some of the trends that we've seen in prices, and we'll also talk about some of the top constraints that we've seen so far in the first 4 months of the market. So right here we have some charts where we're doing a scatter plot of the marginal energy cost for the footprint as a whole and how it compares to the Kansas City temps and how it compares to the Oklahoma City temps. We're looking at real-time and day-ahead prices, real-time prices on the top, day-ahead on the bottom. And basically the takeaway from this is that if you look at the real-time, correlation is, well, it's shaky at best, as we put it, but things get a little bit more interesting in the real-time, or in the day-ahead. You can see, there seems to be a fairly distinctive floor on some of these prices. And as we jump to the next slide here, I think it paints the picture a little bit more clear when you look at how things kind of quickly jump up as soon as we hit 80 degrees. Here we're looking at the marginal energy cost for the footprint versus the Oklahoma City temp. So we have taken congestion out of the equation here in this price. But overall, I still think it paints a pretty clear picture that as we touch 80 degrees, there appears to be a pretty solid price floor where you can see, when we're getting up into the 90s, the marginal energy cost has not been below 40 bucks. And this relationship also holds true to the Kansas City temps, although it's shifted a little bit back. So something to watch for there, and particularly in the day-ahead market. And here's a quick comparison of how that shapes up, that similar relationship shapes up versus the midterm load forecast. So we're taking a look at the next day load forecast versus the clear day-ahead prices on an hourly basis. And once again, this is no surprise. As the demand goes up, the prices go up. But it also appears that we're seeing a fairly defined floor here for the marginal energy cost over the past 4 months, which I think helps paint a pretty good picture of where units may be at within the SPP supply stack. If you're out there managing units and you're looking at a 30,000 megawatt day, having a piece of information like this may help you understand where your unit is going to sit in the supply stack on that day, and whether you're the marginal unit or whether you're below that line or above that line that you may not clear for the day.
Okay, this next slide we're going to look at clear demand and the load forecast. These are all using on-peak averages here. We noticed that coming out of the weekend, SPP has a tendency to clear far more demand than the medium-term load forecast, the MTLF, would suggest is needed. It's the table in the upper right kind of goes through it month by month. You can see, March, really strong overcommitment on Mondays, and then through Friday there was actually a shortfall. April, it kind of just short all around. May, and things continue to shift in June. Both May and June, there's been no undercommitments on average. This would imply that the day-ahead real-time spread would kind of be in line, but it's important to note that that's not the case. So there is something else at work here, in particular Thursday and Friday. It's something we continue to watch. We think there's a couple of reasons why this might be happening. We've seen fairly consistent load forecast errors and wind forecast errors, particularly later within a day. So we think there might be a little bit of extra demand cleared to compensate for that, or possibly there's even just something a little higher level in the market design. It's thus far hard to pin down what's causing this. But we're keeping an eye on this, and also to see if, as it changes, if really it starts to flow through to DART spreads.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we generally look at. I know in a lot of the other markets we try to look at that clear demand versus the load forecast, and that seems to correlate fairly well to day-ahead real-time spreads in a lot of cases, and we're just not at the moment seeing that correlation. So that's something that we're going to continue to watch. And then as Adam mentioned, it does look like just the clear demand versus the forecast appears to be getting better as we move from March through June. So we're going to continue to watch that as well and see how that shapes up for the rest of the summer. So the next thing we're going to go into here is net scheduled interchange, and I feel like there's a lot of interesting observations here, especially for some people that may be new to the SPP market. You can see all the different points where SPP is receiving or sending power for the most part, and you can see on the chart up at the top where the flows are coming from in general. And actually, I should point out the important note here is that a negative number is an import and a positive number is an export. So you can see here that it appears that SPP is sending a significant amount of power to ERCOT and receiving a significant amount of imports from Southern Company, SPA, or that's Southwest Power Administration, and WAUE. There's a couple things to note on here. The first is that the SPA and WAUE flows appear to be highly correlated to hydro flows. If you look at the flows in March, they were significantly lower than what we've seen in April, May, and June. As snow melt begins and we start to move into summer. So we're going to continue to watch those flows, particularly from WAUE, and see if those flows continue to be strong as we head into summer, or if they start to drop off as we get into July and August. A couple other things to note on here, the ERCOT East flows were fairly low in May, and this appears to be the result of a transmission outage on the DC tie that connects ERCOT East and SPP. And that's an important, important fact to point out is that the two flows between ERCOT and SPP are both DC ties. So if there is a transmission outage there, that severely hampers the flows that SPP can share with ERCOT. I also believe that that is why the ERCOT North flows have been so low for the entire 4-month stretch here, as we've seen some transmission work there. If you look at the schedules for July so far, the ERCOT North flows are much higher, and that, I believe, is because the transmission work was completed. The other note on CLECO flows is that they were just much stronger in April and May. I don't think that that's a pattern that's going to continue. I think this was a result of SPP sending power into CLECO due to the outage at the Arkansas 1 nuke. And also just wondering if the weaker flows we're seeing now in June are potentially a result of the transmission dispute between MISO and SPP, and potentially the uncertainty around what's going to happen with that transmission and just limiting the flows between MISO and SPP. And now I just want to jump back to the SPA and WAUE flows. We noticed some very high correlation, as we mentioned, with hydro data. If you look at kind of how the day-ahead and real-time interchange has shaped up so far, taking a look at March, you can see SPP was a net importer, or sorry, a net exporter for the month of March. And day-ahead real-time schedules were fairly tight in the on-peak period, although they deviated quite a bit if you look at kind of the off-peak hours. I think this is a function of a new marketplace, but also you can notice the shape of the curve starts to change quite dramatically in April, May, and June. SPP looks to become a net importer during most of the on-peak hours, and things start to shift to or stay as exports in the off-peak hours. And you can see that that's a fairly defined curve that begins to take shape as gets greater in May and then all the way into June. And if you chart that curve along with scheduled Southwest Power Administration hydro flows. It appears pretty clear that the SPP import curve is shaped primarily by these SPA hydro flows. So really what I'm doing here is SWPA publishes a daily schedule of all their plants on a public site, and you can see the day-ahead schedules for all their plants. And if you look at the curve here, how well that correlates with what you're seeing for the SPP flows, or net scheduled interchange in SPP. It looks like it's a result of pretty much all the other areas netting out to zero or close to zero, and we see imports increasing on the whole into SPP, as SPA hydro starts to spill at its peak levels during the day. So again, this is something that we're going to continue to keep an eye on as we head into later in the summer when hydro flows, so July and August, when hydro flows, potentially start to wind down a little bit. Although, looking at SPA, most of the SPAs run a river hydro. Most of the SPAs run a river hydro, so we'll, I'm not necessarily too concerned that with the snow melt going away that we'll see these change a lot. Again, I think that's going to be primarily from WAUE.
All right, this next slide here, we're going to touch on a few trends in pricing. Average monthly prices at the North and South Hub, both in day-ahead and real-time, have shown a downward trend since inception of the integrated marketplace. That's in line with what we've seen in ERCOT and MISO, their neighbors. So we think that's a pretty good sign that things are performing similar to markets that have a longer history. March prices were really high, basically because of a cold snap, and there were some gas issues. SPP couldn't have picked a better day to go live with this market. March 1st, I think it was one of those polar vortex situations, and there were some really strong price prints within the first few days of the market going live. So it was a nice test for the market right away, and they handled it well. And some of that pricing was strong enough to carry all the way through to the monthly averages. Something that we're seeing too is the day-ahead real-time spread tends to increase over the day. That chart on the bottom is March through June, and that is the North and South Hub. So what's going on here? Earlier we talked about overcommitments, load forecast errors with SPP, wind forecast discrepancies. I think that is a large part of this. As the day goes on, those peak hours are when the forecast tends to be poorest or show its biggest error, and that would suggest greater day-ahead real-time spread, which is actually what we're seeing. Also, in the morning, the commitment seems that maybe it's missing the ramping period. We've seen many days. Today is a good example, actually, where wind is somewhat quiet over the morning or strong over the morning, and as it tapers off or ramps up, that the timing of that can seem to play a big role in whether that the congestion shows up. And that's one of the things that can help drive that, particularly more so north and south, but also cause real-time price volatility. So timing of wind is something today is a great example. We're I think system-wide wind, just as an aside here, has been about a gig all morning. We're expecting it to end the day at over 4, and we're just kind of waiting for that to start. So the timing of that will probably have an impact on real-time price volatility and thus the DART spread.
So the next couple of slides here, we're going to get into some of the top constraints that we're seeing in the new market. The first one is one that if you're familiar with SPP, you saw a lot in the old market as well, and it has not gone away. And this is the constraint in Amarillo at Osage to Canyon East. It's just on the south side of Amarillo, and I know there is some plans to do some transmission improvements here to help alleviate this congestion. But for the time being, this is the major constraint that we've been seeing. The primary driver of this one is wind. In the Texas Panhandle, there's a good number of farms just to the north of this constraint, and really all around kind of that Oklahoma and Texas Panhandle and Hitchland, and a lot of these farms like Wildorado and Majestic. So the primary driver here, this is a big wind-driven constraint. If you look at the chart, what we're showing there is the day-ahead versus real-time shadow pricing. So fairly consistent curve here in the day-ahead with how it looks like the stronger shadow prices tend to be in the off-peak, which, as you can see, it's kind of an upside-down U here for the curve. The off-peak hours is generally when wind is also going to be the strongest in the forecast. And then you can see the real-time shadow prices so far have been significantly over on a pretty consistent basis versus the day ahead.
Another interesting thing, just how pervasive is this constraint? Added up all of the intervals where this was binding since March 1st. Well, March 1st through June 30th, something like 40,000 5-minute intervals. I looked at the real time. It is bound 58% of the time, which is pretty incredible that nearly 2/3 of every real-time interval there's been some Osage congestion. So if you're new to SPP, you've got to get to know Osage because it's going to be there as far as we can tell for forever.
At least until
the
transmission improvements. And that kind of brings us to our next slide here, which we've seen. This is a somewhat newer constraint, we'll call it, especially in the new marketplace. And this is something that began to show up after a new transmission line went into service. I'll just point out that you can see the constraint screenshot here is with the Woodward to FPL switch congestion as well as the Osage congestion. This is not an uncommon screenshot. This is not an uncommon picture for the SPP footprint with both these constraints binding at the same time.
Yeah, you'll see Osage on its own quite a bit, but this constraint first bound on May 4th, and since that time, just kind of as comparison, how much is Osage? Is 2/3 or 58%. Since May 4th, this has been in 25% of the time, which is still pretty substantial. Osage and Woodward are by far the most common constraints, and every interval that this is bound, 76% of the time, Osage is also binding. So you'll see Osage alone, but Woodward and Osage kind of come as a package, or they tend to. Again, on this chart, on this heat map here, that purple area, that's where a huge amount of wind farms are. So the wind is most concentrated. We see strong wind production in the Texas Panhandle, and then it kind of, as wind production grows, it moves up into western Kansas. So this is kind of, if you think of it progressing from south to north, this is kind of the next constraint to hit, and then eventually you'll get into some of the western Kansas congestion. These two constraints are a major driver of the north to south congestion that keeps the north hub suppressed relative to south hub. You'll notice here that the bearish locations, what we did was we pulled some intervals where each of these constraints were binding on their own, and we looked, what nodes are they impacting the most? What settlement locations are they bullish and bearish on the most? They have a lot of shared bearish locations, even when Woodward was binding alone. So wind is pretty bearish for things Amarillo South and well, I guess Amarillo North. Sorry, I had the wrong side of Amarillo there in my mind. So those two by far are the largest constraints.
And this next one here is based on shadow price, and occurrence is not necessarily the next largest constraint, although this is a fairly important constraint that we've seen so far. It's an interesting constraint. If you follow the MISO market, you've probably seen this constraint as well. And this is a constraint that we also felt was interesting based on the fact that we see it, but we see it with two different contingencies, and there's somewhat of a little bit of a pattern, depending on which contingency we're looking at.
Yeah, Easttown. So the two contingencies are the St. Joe to Hawthorne line and the Easttown to Ireton itself. Ireton's output is obviously a huge driver of this. And what we see, the Easttown tends to only show up in the peak periods. It seems more sensitive to demand and power flows between Omaha and Kansas City. Well, the St. Joe to Hawthorne, if it's going to show up in the off-peak, you can bet on it being the St. Joe to Hawthorne variant, if you will. They don't tend to show up together. They have, but usually it's one or the other. And St. Joe is more common, but that Easttown, definitely keep an eye out for that one when it's looking like a high demand situation.
Yep, and I think the one important thing here is the major driver of this is not necessarily wind generation, although when you see these, it's typically on a day where there's probably, I would say typically we're going to get these on days when there's a little bit less wind generation, but the primary driver of this one is the Ireton unit itself. Obviously if that unit is not running, you're going to have much less risk of seeing this congestion. And we do monitor the Ireton unit. We also have proprietary monitors on all these lines as well, so we can see the power flow on these lines at any given moment and kind of get an idea for when this congestion might come in. And one quick kind of fast fact here about SPP, a lot of the constraint names, when they're permanent flow gates in SPP, you'll see this constraint name that just looks like a bunch of letters jumbled together. That is actually the first three letters of, so you can see in the first one there, it's IAT, which is the first three letters of Ireton, then Stranger Creek, the STR, the first three letters of Stranger Creek, and then it's the contingency, so it is the STJ for the first three letters of St. Joe, and then Hawthorne, again. So, and that's how a lot of the permanent flow gates are named in SPP. So when you're seeing these constraint names pop up, that's a way to be able to identify which lines these constraints are happening on. And it, at least in my experience, I haven't seen that in the other ISOs. So looks like a little bit of a different naming convention there from SPP. Now on to the next slide here, where kind of, we're going to jump into our what we're seeing, for the rest of July and the rest of August. Our meteorologists here, we have a team of 4 meteorologists on staff that are, again, doing our own proprietary weather forecasts as well as our demand modeling. And we have, meteorologists dedicated specifically to looking at SPP. He came up with a very detailed weather forecast for July and August for us. And without reading these bullets word for word here, the takeaway is that we're looking at colder than normal temperatures for the northern half of the footprint for most of the remainder of the summer, and some warmer than normal temperatures for the southern half of the footprint. And likewise, on the precip front, better potential for precip in the northern half, and then in August, it actually shifts a little bit to the kind of western half and northern half of the footprint. And really, what the takeaway is from that is, our expectation is that the north-south spread that we've been seeing, since the beginning of the market really shouldn't ease up for the remainder of the summer. We expect, so far, there's been an average of an $8 premium on South Hub. And we don't see any reason, given this load forecast or this weather forecast, that should change. We may have less wind generation out there, but if we're seeing, the above normal temps in the south and the below normal temps in the north, we see no reason that the power flows, moving power from the northern half of the footprint to the southern half, should really shift in any significant manner. So we expect to continue to see kind of that south premium over north hub for the remainder of the summer. The constraint screenshot there on the side is my attempt to give an idea of what it will look like with a lot of different constraints that we're expecting to continue to see. The big ones are Red Willow Mingo, which is moving power from the Gentleman unit in Nebraska down into Kansas on the western side of Nebraska and southwestern side of Nebraska and western side of Kansas there. We also have the Ireton, Woodward, and Osage congestion in there as well to give you an idea of kind of what a potential contour map would look like or could look like for July and August. Yeah. So, and if, the rest of the summer, we tried to take a look at some interesting transmission outages. I will note that the outage list is fairly small at this point. You don't generally expect to see a lot of transmission maintenance going on in the middle of summer. You expect that to start to pick back up at the end of September and into October. So we were limited somewhat in our calls on transmission outages for congestion, and really think that demand is obviously going to be the big demand and wind are going to be the major drivers of congestion for the remainder of the summer. But with that said, there were a couple line outages that we took a look at and are at least worth noting for the rest of the summer here.
Yeah, the one on the left here, Archie to Montrose, the 161 kV line. It's been, so I guess it's out now through 8/8. It's been congesting pretty heavily. There's been the KC South to Montrose outage. So now that line itself is out, sorry, that was a bit misleading there. The one that has been congesting, Archie to Montrose, is now an outage. So there are limited lines in that area that carry power away from the Montrose facility. So we think that there's a chance that Montrose to North Raymore could congest until that Archie part of it comes back. We're going to need some high demand to kind of test this theory. Of course, we've only had a couple of days where we've really tested 40 gigs. So, as the month draws on, as we see some heat, as it looks more like summer, hopefully, we'll definitely be keeping an eye on this one. And on the right, AES to Tarby, this one seems to play in with the Bonanza to Hackett congestion. It's kind of, I guess it's a little bit south of Fort Smith, but this isn't a long-term outage. I believe it's listed as an opportunity outage. So
they actually just changed it to a emergency outage. Was that the one that they changed this morning?
Oh yeah,
an emergency outage. So and we've been seeing a little bit of this Bonanza to Hackett congestion, mostly in the day ahead. Haven't seen a whole lot going on around this in the real time yet with this outage. So something we're going to continue to watch, but at this point it seems to be mostly a day ahead risk as opposed to real time.
Okay, on the left here we see Altoona to Butler is out through another week or so, and Altoona to Northeast Parsons will be out for August. These are in the southeast Kansas area, and they tend to help drive Neosho area congestion. We see Lacine to Neosho and Neosho to Riverton are the two primary constraints that we see bind in that area. Again, these will play, this is a little more sensitive to wind as it's closer to the high wind production areas, but also demand. Neosho to, Lacine to Neosho has been coming in sporadically in the day ahead and not been doing much in real time over the past week. But that's something, as again, load picks up, we'll be keeping a close eye on.
Yep, and the last few outages here, there's just a bunch of week-long or 3-day-long outages around Tupelo. These are, smaller 138 kV lines, and looking at this just historically, we saw some congestion back in early May around Tupelo to Tupelo Tap. And just thinking this southern area of Oklahoma and Arkansas and Louisiana may be an area to watch, particularly as we get into some of these 100-degree days in the middle of the summer. We noted that one thing to watch here was output from the Seminole unit. And when I wrote this slide on Monday, the Seminole unit had not run since early May. And of course, yesterday, the Seminole unit ramped up for the first time. And we, again, do monitor that unit. So that's something that we're also going to keep an eye out for is how that Seminole unit is going to run for the duration of the summer. I was not aware of any planned outages there, so it seems like that unit was just running for demand. And that's something that we're going to keep watching. As demand picks up, if that's the way that unit's going to run, we should expect to see that unit running for much of July and much of August. And so before we get into questions, and again, if you have any questions, you can type them in the side. We just wanted to, after we talked about some of these fundamental drivers that we're looking at in SPP, we wanted to, show people who have not yet had a chance to see our reports, kind of what we're covering on a daily basis. Where this is what you're viewing now on my screen is a copy of our next day price forecast. And so in here, we're doing an hour-by-hour forecast for the north and south hubs. And we're doing it both a day ahead and real time. So you can see here what we're forecasting, where, actually an hour ending 15 tomorrow, we do have some north real-time pricing over the day ahead. And we're also, here, and this again is just a summary tab, but we're showing our hour-by-hour wind forecast and how that forecast compares to what SPP has out there for tomorrow, and also the load forecast. And then we do also, note what constraints we're modeling and what constraints our model is spitting out for the day tomorrow, both day ahead and real time, to give you a good idea of, how that day ahead spread, our day ahead real time spread is going to shape up based on what we're seeing in our proprietary models. And if you jumping through the report here real quick, as I mentioned, we have a meteorologist who is focused specifically on SPP. So we're giving you that hour-by-hour load forecast, as well as a brief summary on what he's seeing for the weather risks and our temperature forecast for each of the major cities. We're also noting departures from normal, cloud cover, and any kind of upside or downside risks that we may be seeing on the load forecast. So you can see here for tomorrow, mentioning the slight upside risk for Amarillo and Oklahoma City. And this is primarily due to the fact that today in Oklahoma City you have a lot of cloud cover, where tomorrow skies should be sunny. And with that sunshine comes the higher temps, and we're starting to see a little bit more upside risk. While our load forecast day over day hasn't necessarily changed all that much. If we're looking at risk, the risk may be in the southern part of the footprint for tomorrow. On the congestion tab here, we have some commentary around what constraints we think would bind. Tomorrow's a big wind day, so we obviously mentioned the Osage and the Woodward congestion in both the day ahead and real time. And you can see what our model is outputting for Osage congestion in the day ahead here, as well as the Osage congestion in the real time. Pretty much have that constraint 1 through 24 for the day tomorrow. And we are also doing an import forecast, so you can see how we're shaping our curve. Again, with that similar curve around the hydro flows, going from an exporter in the off-peak period to an importer as we move into the middle of the on-peak. And also doing, again, our hour-by-hour wind forecast. And you can see how the Genscape forecast may deviate from SPP's forecast, and a good opportunity there to identify some risk in that, on a day where there may be an even wider spread than this between the two forecasts, that's typically when we, tend to get some real-time volatility and risk around, seeing that real-time price over the day ahead. So I think that's pretty much what we have here for the presentation. I will jump back into the slide, and if anyone has any questions, like we said, we can. I
see a couple here. Are there ICE or OTC products? There are ICE products. They are currently monthly tenors. We were under the impression they would be rolling out a daily product. We have yet to see that. We're told that that is still coming. But right now, as far as ICE contracts, we see monthly, quarterly, annual products, north and south, peak, off-peak products, pretty standard product rollout. Start with the most basics. As far as other things that you can trade in SPP, there's virtuals, there's FTRs, there's murmurings of something similar to up to congestion way down the road.
Yes, I think
that's phase 2, maybe.
I think so. I think that's
technical.
I think they're, believe they are discussing with PJM and MISO kind of how their products are working at this point. And so that may be something, but for now, it's just the straight virtual products that are available.
And actually, the second question that we have here, well, I guess let me rephrase this a little bit. Just virtual activity trends. We could see in the dam clear reports, there's been pretty consistent virtual bids and offers cleared. It's a net offer. We haven't really seen much growth. Hopefully, we'll start to see some more of that. Our general impression is the first few months, I think there's been a lot of participants and potential participants just kind of in observe and collect mode. And that's kind of our general impression. So we expect to see growth in that area as more people gain interest and get more comfortable with kind of how things roll.
Yep. I think, so there's a question about our wind forecast. We do have wind forecasts for both the bow day and the next day that are included in the current suite of Power IQ reports. We also have available wind forecasts out for a 7-day time horizon. And then we have load forecasts that actually go out 14 days that are available that we're looking at. So we do, as far as the load and the wind, have a longer-term horizon for some of those forecasts. And I guess one thing that I would point out is that if there's demand for some of our other products in the Power IQ suite, we do have a PJM weekly and a MISO weekly report where we're doing bow week and next week reports. If there's demand for that in the SPP marketplace, that's something that we can definitely look into doing. And we're kind of open to feedback at this point as far as whether or not there is demand for a product like that. As we're kind of wrapping up here, I will just throw up our contact information. If there are any additional questions that maybe come up after the PowerPoint or as you're going through the slides later on, feel free to email Adam or myself. We're also available on Instant Messenger. Fairly easy to remember, Genscape Steve and Genscape Adam. And so again, if there's any questions that come up after the presentation, feel free to shoot them along to us. We also have some slides in the appendix. And these were just some things that we mentioned on the earlier in the slides about the SPP supply mix. There's a couple interesting things pieces of data that SPP publishes. One of them includes a 5-minute supply stack. So we're able to capture the 5-minute supply mix for SPP, and we can chart it in things like this where you can see how what the load was total and what fuel was making up, or what fuel was capturing that load. I think the important takeaway, or one of the important takeaways from this slide, was how we noticed with the increase in June demand, when we look at the on-peak June demand, we actually saw an increase from 60% to 73% in coal, indicating that coal had picked up most of the load growth and not gas-fired generation, which stayed fairly consistent in the low 20s percentage-wise. And the other thing, as we mentioned on the earlier slide, is that you can see wind generation has made up a fairly healthy portion of the supply stack, and that seems to be only growing at this point. We mentioned the wind. Just a couple quick notes on the wind generation. This is kind of an average wind production. May for us showed both the highest and lowest average wind days, and that's typical of what you would expect to see for a general wind curve. Where wind is the strongest in the shoulder months and then picks up as you get into, or drops down as you get into the warmer summer months. Next slide here was just again on our load, so some more details around the load, what we were seeing for the temps on the record high day. You can see we were across the footprint up in the hundreds, and how the load has kind of shaped up over the first 4 months here. As Adam mentioned, SPP picked a really good day to go live with their new market, where we saw some of the highest load for March, and load that we didn't really touch again until early May. So I think that's it for the presentation. Again, thanks for joining us, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions that come up. And as Jamie mentioned earlier, everyone who was on the call will be getting a copy of the slide. So I think that's it. Thank you, everyone.